Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to be covering some of the ground that we just heard, but from the Ottoman perspective. What interests me is the Ottoman response and the role of Ottoman merchants in formulating a legal space in the Eastern Mediterranean as a result of attacks by British privateers in the middle of the 18th century. So what I'll do to begin with is to talk about the earlier responses of the British at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, and how this created the legal precedent that was then used later on. I'll then speak about the crisis of the 1740s that we've just heard about so eloquently, before moving on to seeing its longer-lasting effects later on in the 18th century, before coming to some tentative conclusions. So to begin with, what happened at the end of the 17th century? And we would have heard, I'm sure, from Professor Hayward, was he here, who has worked, of course, significantly on this period. This is the first time during the War of the 9 Years that British and French privateers are in the Eastern Mediterranean in significant numbers, enough numbers to cause problems for the Ottomans. Problems means, in this context, that they block up Ottoman ports, that they make attacks under Ottoman cannons, and that they assault ships carrying Ottoman subjects. It's the fighting within Ottoman ports that causes the biggest distress, particularly in the port of Izmir, which is one of the most important commercial centres in the region. And the Ottomans quite correctly saw these attacks as a violation not only of their friendship with the British particularly, but of their sovereignty. And this necessitated a response. So in 1696, after a series of particularly devastating attacks, the Kapıdan Pasha, the Ottoman Grand Admiral, is dispatched by the Ottoman government to Izmir to speak to the local consuls and the local captains, and an imperial decree is made stipulating that no acts of violence should happen from a line between Kos, Andros and Izmir, and that if any attack happened beyond that line, the perpetrator of the attack would be liable to pay compensation to that person who had been attacked. So essentially what the Ottomans are doing is saying everything to the north of this line, everything to the north of that space is a no-go zone, no attacks can happen, and if you do attack, you are liable for the compensation. Now, this is a fairly radical idea by anyone's standards in the 17th century in terms of legal space. And publicly, the British ambassadors resented it greatly. They saw it as against the known rules of war, against the known rules of nations. But privately, they seem to have tried to enforce it. So, for example, in 1697, Captain Charles Newman of the Blackham Galley makes an attack beyond this line, and he receives this devastating remonstrance from Baron Paget, the ambassador, saying that you've been told more than once at my house what inconveniences the taking of a prize within the limits might occasion, and after that, so near as Tenedos, to take so inconsiderable a prize and bring so much trouble upon your owners and us is inexcusable. So privately, the ambassadors are remonstrating. Publicly, they are speaking against it. Now, why would they speak against it in public? Well, the idea of what is territorial waters is still quite contested at the end of the 17th century. There are those who believe that none of the waters outside of your own bays and harbours can be claimed by a sovereign power. However, by the beginning of the 18th century, most of the European states, in accordance with older laws, and indeed the Ottomans, this is their attitude too, says that a limited amount of space of water outside of your shores can be claimed. And the general rule is, if you can shoot at it, then you can claim it. And that's what the Ottomans and the British basically do. What this line does essentially says that's irrelevant. We can claim and make our law over as much of the sea as we want to. Now, that is a fundamentally radical idea, because how do you prove who did what when there's no one watching? How do you know where this line starts and stops, because it can't be physically drawn in the water? So this creates huge problems for the British, but the Ottomans really see it as a great idea. We don't see it used so much in the 1690s and early 1700s. It comes into its own in the crisis of the 1740s during this War of the Austrian Succession. Very early on in that war, British privateers come to Ottoman waters and begin to do what they did in the last conflict. They begin to make attacks in Ottoman ports. They begin to assault ships carrying Ottoman subjects, and the complaints made by both Ottoman subjects and their French carriers are very well received by the Ottoman government. So this, for example, is a command issued to the Kapıdan Pasha and to all the governors of the Aegean and Anatolia and Syria in 1744, saying that because of these attacks and because of these seizures and captures, being contrary to the capitulations, so they're saying they're not just bad, they're illegal, under Ottoman ports and in their shores, that this regulation has to be brought back. They speak specifically of the old regulations that have been brought in the 1690s and the 1700s. However, they make a rather radical change in 1744 to ensure that no attacks at all happen anywhere near Ottoman shores. So the command that was issued to the Europeans, this is the Italian translation that was given to the British, basically says that you cannot commit any acts of war from this line between the Morea and the coast of Libya. So what the Ottomans essentially do is they say, and this is an Ottoman copy of the same command, they say you cannot go not just past this line, you can't go past there. And that's a really, really big move in terms of international law. It's basically saying that the entire Levant, not just the Aegean, every single thing past that line cannot be attacked. There can't be armed ships coming in there. And this is a profound point. How does one then enforce this? You can say what you like in legal terms. You can say, yes, these are my waters. But it doesn't mean very much unless you can actually get some legal cases successfully prosecuted. And this is just what the Ottomans managed to do. So the case of the ruby that we heard about earlier basically set off this whole chain of events. It was such a traumatic attack, 20,000 gurush worth, which is a huge sum of money, silver coins, 20,000 silver coins worth of goods, are taken by the ruby of Ottoman goods off of this ship. And the petitions of the Ottoman merchants were so forceful that that's what essentially created that command. What also happens is the Ottomans got compensation. The petition was made, the remonstrances were made to the ambassador, and after some legal wrangling, this amount was paid in full by the British Admiralty. Now that shows that this is obviously something that's powerful. This is not just a line in the ocean, and this is a new kind of legal regime. And although the British resented it clearly, it was something that they had to abide by. The Ottomans had issued an imperial command, and they had to go with it. And this doesn't necessarily mean that attacks stop, far from it. The 1740s see at least 24 attacks by British privateers of significant prizes of French ships carrying Ottoman goods. And we can see a bit of a pattern here that helps us to understand why the Ottomans were so angry about it. If we look at where the attacks are happening, it's in two key places. The first is at the entrance to the Aegean. The majority of the attacks happened in that space, kind of where Kythera is, sort of in between Crete and the south of Greece proper. But we also have huge amounts of attacks between Cyprus and the Syrian coasts. Now, why would this be a problem for the Ottomans? Well, the Aegean one is particularly bad because that's a huge trade route, international trade route. But it's also a huge supply route. And this is where the clue for the Syrian coast comes in. The 1740s is a time of great famine throughout the Ottoman Empire, in southern Anatolia and in Syria. Huge amounts of starvation. There's a terrible winter, for example, in 1742, 1743. The crops are ruined. No food is coming through. So they rely even more on the grain supplies of North Africa coming to the rest of the empire. And of course, the Ottomans don't have the kind of merchant shipping to take huge amounts of grain, so they have to use European ships. Who's got the most ships? The French ships. So pretty much every single one of these crosses represents an attack not on French goods, but on Ottoman grain, rice, and coffee that's going to help the starving provinces in the east. And worse than that, Fortunatus Wright, who we heard about earlier of the fame, even takes money, 5,000 gurush worth, from an Ottoman governor who was going to buy grain for the starving people of Tripoli in Syria. So yes, there is resentment from the British, but from the Ottoman perspective, this isn't just a violation of a friendship. This is a potentially catastrophic situation for their relationship with their subjects. And it's from this that we see this huge amount of legal paperwork being developed in both the Ottoman case and with the British ambassador. So, for example, this document shows some Cretan merchants who'd been shipping some grain for the benefit of Syria. And they had their goods, a huge amount of goods stolen by the Fame, and they are petitioning to the British ambassador directly. They also send representatives to London to try and get compensation, but the main place that they are able to do this is through their petitions to the Ottoman state. And there are dozens upon dozens of documents exactly like this one of Ottoman merchants in Greek and in Ottoman Turkish, because it's not just Ottoman Muslims who are being attacked here, protesting this violation of their rights and of their goods. And through successful prosecution, the Ottomans are able to restore not the goods, but to gain compensation. And almost, well, between 80,000 and 100,000 gurush, so between 80,000 and 100,000 silver coins is paid by the British in compensation to Ottoman merchants between 1744 and 1747. So this isn't just a chimerical line in the middle of the ocean. This represents a strong legal regime that is carried out and implemented by the Ottomans. So in essence, this line that sees a violation not just of Ottoman waters but of Ottoman subjects is a huge problem for the Ottomans in terms of food supply, and they are able to then develop, based on precedent, this legal regime that can create a safe space, at least in theory, and then implement it in practice. Now, this would be an interesting case if it was just in the 1740s, but it isn't. It's carried on later in future conflicts in the remainder of the 18th century. So, for example, in the 7 Years' War, when the privateers again return and attacks are made in 1754 and 1755, the Ottomans once again threaten to issue this decree. They don't even issue it in 1755, they just threaten it. And the mere threat leads to the Admiralty in London to issue a strong set of directives telling their privateers not to attack any French ships carrying Ottoman goods. And certainly, if they do, not to take those goods or harm those Ottoman subjects. Although this doesn't work, and in 1756, the Ottomans, again, using precedent, reinstitute the line between the Morea and Libya. But it's really during the huge privateering activity during the American War at the end of the 1770s and the beginning of the 1780s that we see the line, in a sense, really come into its own in the same way it had done in the 1740s. There were huge amounts of attacks and some pretty gross violations of the rights of Ottoman subjects. It wasn't just French ships that the British privateers were attacking, it was Ottoman ships now. And that really raised the game. So, for example, we have this one Captain Baxter who takes a ship of Ottoman pilgrims coming from Palestine and abuses them in horrific ways, takes their stuff, beats them up, dumps them. It's a huge scandal. They're also taking ships again in Ottoman ports, but this time the Ottomans start to fire on them with their cannon. So this is a potentially explosive situation. It's when a Scottish captain called Charles Mackenzie takes 2,000 gurush worth of food that's destined for another starving Syria. Syria, once again, is suffering food shortages, that the line is reinstituted, because the Ottomans cannot afford, one, a war with an ally, and two, to have the same kind of food shortages that they had in the 1740s. So it's really the precedents of this that we see coming back. And again, the petitionary aspect of it is hugely important. It's not just the Ottoman government coming up with some scheme. They're reacting to the complaints of subjects of all kinds. And one of the cases that saw the reinstitution of this line was by Michal Drosso of Tinos, who was again shipping wheat from Acre to Izmir. Anatolia was starving at this point, via Cyprus. And just off Cyprus, his ship, which has Tunisian merchants and Ottoman Greeks and Ottoman Muslims on board, is seized, and they're beaten up and their stuff is taken. And it's through this petition that the line is once again instituted, and it's through this that the Ottomans are able to put pressure on the Europeans. And the command that's issued in 1780 is so strong, so much stronger than that in the 1740s. They try and show their generosity by being restrained at first. They say, well, if you behave yourselves, naughty children, and don't attack us, we will keep the 3-mile rule that's traditional. However, if you do attack our subjects, again, we will make the borders of Islam, the hudud al-Islamiyya. So we're going to make sure that Sharia law, the Ottoman imperial law, is implemented in this line, and you will be as liable at sea as you are on land, along this line that's fixed between the Morea and Crete and Sirte. And this, again, is not just sent to one or two officials. This is sent to all the Ottoman admirals, all the Ottoman governors in the empire, or the literal empire anyway, and to all of the European diplomats. So this is a legal regime that they are able to once again enforce, and people like Drosso do receive compensation from the British. So once again, it's not something that's just on paper, it's something that they are able to enforce. Now, what can we take away from this story? Well, this series of stories. First of all, it's important to note that the Ottomans were not passive actors when they saw their waters being attacked. And they weren't just acting because it was something that was an annoyance to them. They were acting on the representations of their subjects. And this is quite a crucial thing. And these subjects were not high officials. They were ordinary merchants from all over the empire. They were from the islands, they were from North Africa, they were from Greece, they were from Syria, they were from all over the place. They were Muslims, Christians, and Jews. All of them suffered equally for only trying to transport their goods, and particularly trying to transport goods that would be feeding their compatriots, which of course generated this hugely negative response. What's important about this Ottoman response is it doesn't resort to violence. So they could very easily have said that we will just fire upon you if you do this again. They try and use a legal mechanism in order to avoid conflict and to gain compensation for their subjects. And this is ultimately one of the principles of Islamic law in this sense. Punishment is not what you look for in theft, it's compensation. So the Ottomans are able to transport this idea of Sharia out to the sea successfully. Because if it had just been this decree and there had been no compensation, this story would be irrelevant. But what we see here is a legal regime the Ottomans implement and successfully implement in an attempt to defend their waters against the violence of supposedly friendly ships. Thank you very much for your time.